Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the conference. We'll be starting a little bit late this morning, maybe around 9:15. So if you would like to get some coffee or some refreshments outside, you may do so. Thank you. Good morning again, everyone. Finally, we'll be starting the second day of the CALESA Conference on emerging human rights issues and vulnerabilities. So before we begin, I'd like to request for everyone to stand up for the invocation and the national anthem. Thank you.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of the Lord. Our Heavenly Father, we offer you our thanksgiving. We thank you for everyone gathered here today to walk with you. May we ask you for your blessings and guidance so that the activities set for this undertaking be successful. We ask you to open our eyes to see the wonderful things from this activity. We ask that you open our ears so that we may retain the invaluable knowledge. Open our minds for us to think wisely. Put us with understanding, cooperation, and peace in fulfilling our responsibilities. Open our hearts so that we may receive your everlasting love, and open our spirit so that we may know that you are with us all throughout the day. We ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Okay, let's all be seated. Thank you. So let's jump right in. We have our first speaker, Attorney Ron Gutierrez. So Attorney Ron Gutierrez will be presenting a paper on the impact of on environmental shifts on vulnerable sectors. And I'd like to introduce him, give some information about him as well. So Attorney Gutierrez obtained both his degrees in Management Economics in 1988 and Law in 1995 from Ateneo de Manila University, where he graduated with honors. From the London School of Economics, he finished his Master's of Science degree in Environmental Assessment and Evaluation in 2000 with merit and as a British Chevening Scholar. He is currently the Executive Director of Upholding Life and Nature, or ULAN, a professor at the Ateneo Law, where he teaches environmental regulation, law on natural resources, and consumer protection, and is an associate professor of the Philippine Judicial Academy, or PhilJA. I also want to add that Ron was my professor in environmental regulation in 2007, so he's been teaching in the law school for quite a while now. His affiliations also include being a member of the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law and the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide. On top of the environment, his other advocacies include promoting the rights of indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities. Let's hear it from Attorney Ron Gutierrez.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to go through one by one with our distinguished guests here, but in the interest of time, I'll skip that. I just want to quickly express my thanks for being invited here to talk about a topic that is quite close to my heart. Many of the comments and observations I'll make here are derived from my work as an NGO worker. And so let's begin. No? So my topic is impacts of environmental shifts on environmental sectors. No? Now, let's parse through each of those key phrases. No? Number one would be the environmental shifts. Okay, and something that's currently happening right now, which is in the news, is what's happening in California. No? Now, several months back, I think in the latter part of 2022, the US was worried about drought affecting them, no? And that in fact, there's been warning in those who live in LA to stop watering your gardens, so on and so forth. But in the latter part of the year, it started to rain, and it rained really heavily, no? So much so that the funny part of the news was that many Californians or those who live in LA don't know how to drive with wet roads, no? But it went on, no? And one of the impacts, I don't know what happened. So yung environmental shifts, no? One of the impacts is the reappearance of an ancient lake, the Tulare Lake in California, no? Because the rains, the atmospheric river stream that kept on dumping water in that part of the US kept on going, I think even in the early part of the year, no? Now, it has already stopped, and the lake has already covered acres upon acres of what used to be farmlands in California. No? Now, they're worried that even after the rain has ceased, no, that the heavy snow that was dumped in the Nevada mountains will start melting come summer season and then carry on. No? And so that water is not, that lake is not bound to disappear in the next few months. No? That the worst is still to come as far as they're concerned. That's one of them. No? So they're worried about snow melt. Of course, the big story in 2022 is the flooding in Pakistan, no? Which destroyed 1.7 million homes, resulted in the internal displacement of around 32 million people, submerged one-third of the country, and the World Bank estimates the total damage to be $14.9 billion. No? And that the cost needed for recovery is around 16.3 billion. Now, this flooding was followed by severe heat wave, no? And the flooding is still there, and that it's considered as one of the worst flooding incidents of the in recent memory, no? Now, the Philippines, of course, is not used to these problems, no? So this one is in the news recently. I picked it up from news. This is from Typhoon Amang, which battered the Bicol region in the Philippines. No, nothing unusual. The Philippines is visited by at least 20, on the average 20 typhoons on a yearly basis. But how many of you can recall a typhoon in April? Based on my my description by Attorney Perillo, I've been around quite a while. I don't recall a typhoon in April. So this is quite unusual, no? Na I remember getting used to the idea that the worst typhoons happen in December. But you know, December is a festive month or season for across the globe, no? And so to have the prospect of severe typhoons hitting the country at that particular point in time, no? And there was even one really bad typhoon which which battered Bicol region on the 24th of December. You can imagine what that must feel like, no? I know that for a fact because one of my staff was actually there when it happened, and she would recall that they just, made sure that they finished the Christmas Eve dinner, and then tried. As soon as that was done, they hunkered down to safety, no, because they knew that the eye of the storm was about to hit them in a matter of hours. No? Now, climate change is something that that has been anticipated. All of this is what we would say climate change. Although I remember that this is something that we didn't know exactly what it would look like. No, I've been on the involved on the climate change discussion since the late 1990s, and in other words, in the early part of the whole discussion, no, or discourse. And then I remember that when we were talking about climate change, the way that I would describe every time I would talk about it is like I'm Noah saying that there's bound to be a flood happening. And people were like, yeah, just gather every couple of animals that you get and build your ark, whatever you want. No, but they didn't believe exactly what we were saying. No, now it's already upon us. And I could also recall at that time we were saying that, oh, when climate change hits, it's going to be in the form of sea level rise, no? Of course, for Filipinos, wow, scary, di ba? What is sea level rise, no? For a country that's used to flooding. In fact, I have my colleagues from Southeast Asia, and then and whenever we talk in our native languages, I would say, what do you call your language? They say it's Bahasa. And I would tell them, oh, we speak Bahasa also in the Philippines. And I said, really? Yeah, Bahasa Malabon, no? Because we have so much flood. Literally, it means it's flooded in Malabon. This is a low-lying town that's perennially flooded. So I made for those who are not Filipino, it's a pun, no? It's a play on words. Bahasa Malabon literally means it's flooded in Malabon. Okay, so this is another picture. It's a typical scene in Malabon. Sometimes it's because of high tide. And that's why they've, in a way, adapted. Look at their tricycles. They use pedals. The first time I saw that in Valenzuela and Malabon, I said, wow, they're now, climate conscious, that they're not using engines, gasoline-fueled engines, because of climate change awareness. It's the other way around. It's because of the floods that's already affecting them that it's more useful that you just pedal your way across the floods and not because of some other thing, no? So, for Filipinos now, we know that it's in the form of flash floods, of severe weather events, severe typhoons, and if there are still Filipinos here who are not convinced that climate change is upon us, now we have more than our share of severe weather events. No, I think the one that really woke us up, especially those living in the metropolis, was Milenio. No? When the height of the typhoon hit the metropolis, and we all woke up with trees that have been tumbled down, and then, of course, Yolanda happened, no? And then almost every year, there's a severe typhoon that hits the country. Okay, now, of course, this is supposed to be a global thing, and this is no longer isolated in the Philippines. Europe itself has experienced heavy rains, fierce winds, and it's now all over the world, no? There is no shortage of news in any part of the world where severe weather event is affecting society, no? Now, I'll be focusing on the vulnerable sectors, no? And the vulnerable sector that I'll be talking about would be three groups: the persons with disabilities, senior citizens, indigenous peoples, because this is the sector that I currently work in. No? Now, I talked about climate change, so I'll be referring to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and see where the word vulnerable comes in. No? And you find it in the preamble, wherein it says it recognizes that low-lying and other small island countries and countries with low-lying coastal, arid and semi-arid areas, etc., are particularly vulnerable to climate change. You also find it in the principles section, no, um, talking about the specific needs and special circumstances of developing countries, especially those that are particularly vulnerable to the effects, no? And then, of course, all of these have to translate into commitments, no? So, Article 4 talks about how developed country parties and other developed parties included in Annex 2, no? Now, don't mind those distinctions. Basically, the developed countries shall assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable, no, to the adverse effects of climate change, no? Now, if you will notice, almost all of these references to vulnerability apply to countries in general, no? So parang it's more of the states that are vulnerable to climate change. But of course, even if we know in international law that you rarely talk about individuals, no, or groups, and that there's a tendency to talk about it in the form of the subject of international law, which are the states. But at the end of the day, the states are comprised of its citizens and people, no? So eventually, you end up with the specific sectors, no? Now, rather than focus, of course, on legalese, for me, the more important thing is how does this translate to the actual people who you consider as vulnerable, no? So, I'll give you one really good example. This one, in case of fire, do not use elevator, use the stairs, okay? We can use that for earthquakes or any other calamity wherein somebody who's in the fourth floor, like us, will need to go downstairs, no? Okay, now, this is the advice of the disaster agency, okay? What about somebody who uses wheelchairs? If something happens right now, do we know exactly what to do? Did we actually train for that? Does the Red Cross actually know? The answer is no, because I went and asked them, what is your SOP for people who are using wheelchairs? Maybe our guests from Spain, do you have a specific procedure as far as people who use wheelchair when in times of calamity? Offhand, does anybody know what to do? See? So that is one particular concern, diba? That apparently we talk about earthquake drills, we talk about all these things, but of course, one possibility is that a person who doesn't need a wheelchair will suddenly need or will be incapable of taking the stairs right there and then because something hit the leg or some injury happened. That's one possibility. But there is also the possibility that there is already somebody who cannot really take the stairs even if it's going down. But it's still not incorporated into the disaster management plans of the country. Okay? Now, of course, we can extend that to senior citizens. But remember, the other sector that I also work in are indigenous peoples. No? Now, if there are indigenous peoples and there's an earthquake on the fourth floor, is there a procedure for them? Do you actually need to have a special procedure for them? No. Kasi kung wala naman sila, if they don't have a disability, you really don't need anything for them. But are they vulnerable? The point that I'm trying to make is that you cannot categorize them in just one box, no? That just because they're a vulnerable sector, then you have one procedure for all of them. They are vulnerable to a particular threat or risk, but not across the board. You don't treat them like any other vulnerable sector. And that is something that later on I will be talking about as to what's needed, no? Okay, now, I'll talk a little about what ULAN does. My organization, Upholding Life and Nature, or ULAN, has actually been working with indigenous peoples since its inception, no? And for the last decade, we found ourselves involved in disability issues. Uh, Embarrassingly, it's because there was a small funding opportunity that opened to us, and then we took it on. It's not totally outside of our mandate because we consider ULAN not an environmental organization per se, but a human rights organization that works on environmental, indigenous, and disability issues. No? And then later on, we incorporated it. We internalized the issue so much that we found ourselves amending our articles of incorporation to include it in our primary purpose. No? So what we discovered is that there's really no legal entity that advances the rights of persons with disabilities. That's why we found ourselves working on that sector. But it's well within our human rights orientation. No? Now, why am I bringing this up? Because we worked on election issues in 2016, 19, and most recently in 2022. And we said, you know, we utilize public schools as voting centers. Now, if you go around in Metro Manila, most of the public schools are already multi-story, no? And then if you go into the provinces, they're single story, but they're so vast and expansive, no? That for you to walk from the gate to one of the rooms on the in the middle of the Philippine summer, it's going to be very exhausting, especially for somebody who's already more than 60 or who has a disability. No? So we pushed heavily for EAPPs, or emergency accessible polling places. Now, why am I bringing this all up? No, just briefly, our conclusion was the Commission on Elections of the Philippines have to put up special facilities so that these vulnerable sectors, particularly PWDs and senior citizens, will be able to vote, because the current facilities, the ones that they are requiring ordinary voters to use, are not suited for senior citizens and persons with disabilities. No? They are for young people. They're for children, essentially. They're not for adults, and especially adults with special needs. No? Now, why am I bringing this all up? Because, unfortunately, the same edifices, the same facilities are also used as evacuation centers. So whenever you have a major typhoon hitting the country, they use this as facilities. No? So this is actually a public school. You can see the blackboard. And that they've used it as an evacuation center. So now, are these same facilities suitable for these vulnerable sectors? No? Now, what's needed? No? Okay. Number one is we need to have data. We need to know who are these vulnerable sectors. No? Now, senior citizens, we don't have a problem because you can extrapolate it from the date of your birth, di ba? So, you get a passport, you get a license, or whatever ID you have, you just add 60, and then you can find out who are the senior citizens in your area. The problem is with persons with disabilities. There was a time when Filipinos are embarrassed at the idea that they have someone in the family, particularly someone with mental illness, or somebody with cerebral palsy, for instance. They don't want to take them out, nor do they want people to know that they have. No, that has sort of changed. No, it's rare that you hear about families na suddenly discovering that somebody in their family has a disability. No, it's now more commonly accepted. Now, however, the reality is that a number of them do not find the value in telling people that they have disabilities. No? It's only recently that they've discovered why they need to inform the government that they have disability because of the 20% discount that they finally get from buying goods, etc., and other services. No? So that has become a come-on. the discount that you can get from buying medicines or from availing of health services, that has become a very strong incentive for PWDs to start registering themselves and telling people that we have this ability. And so the process has begun for PWDs to actually start registering themselves, and the local governments have the data. Unfortunately, there is no national effort to aggregate that data. So you have different local government units with data on PWDs, but the national government doesn't know how many they are. And so this memorandum circular, we pushed the DILG to require the PWDs, the PDAOs, the strengthening the function of the persons with disability affairs offices, to start consolidating them, because you need it for national policy. I remember that the Congress debating about whether or not to increase the mandatory employment percentage from 2% to 1%, or those requiring the government to give them like an allowance. They don't know what the impact of that in the budget is, because they don't have the national data. No? So getting the data is number one. No? Now, next, and I think the more important thing, we need to develop sensitivity. Okay? What do the PWDs need? What do the senior citizens need? And what do the IPs need? No? Now, I'll give a good example. This is a screenshot of my class when we were still doing it online. Or whenever I'm lazy to go to Makati and just tell them, let's do it online. No? I think this is a recent picture. So, we just have it via Teams. No? I prefer Microsoft Teams. So. And this is not an unusual scenario. No? This is common globally, especially during the pandemic. This is what we were, what we resorted to when we could not do online teaching. Although each and every one of us here can probably speak volumes on the travails that we had to go through when we were doing this online, whether as a teacher or as a student. No? But for IPs, how do you do online teaching? It's not specific to their ethnicity. It has something to do with the availability of Wi-Fi in where they're at. Because during the pandemic, they were locked in their respective places, no, yung ancestral homes nila. Unfortunately, most of them don't have access to Wi-Fi. We know that in the Philippines, this is not something that you take for granted outside of the metropolis. Or maybe even in some cities, this is not something that you can expect to have, no? You go to other countries, pinamimigay lang nila yung passwords of their Wi-Fi. But here in the Philippines, especially our guests, have you experienced like having problems getting Wi-Fi in restaurants or in other public places? It's not readily shared, no? So you can imagine if you live in the mountains and then you say, okay, we will just, teach you via online. It's not readily available, no? You can also try to imagine what the impact is on the livelihood of the IPs, no? Now, PWDs, on the other hand, are a diverse group, no? In fact, if you list down the different types of disabilities, there's no template on how best to accommodate their needs, no? The blind have a different need. The deaf community has a different need. The wheelchair users actually have a different need, no? Now, these have to be incorporated into all plans and programs. Unfortunately, our government actually does not seem to take all of that into account. And I'll give several examples later. Now, the other environmental shift that I want to focus, and then so you already saw that picture, is the environmental shift in our the things that we need to do or to change because of environmental issues around us. No? You've probably heard of electric vehicles. No? Europe has been more pronounce on this. In fact, I think European countries have already pegged a particular year, if I'm not mistaken, because they're different all over the European community. But some are as early as 2030 or 2028 that they will phase out the registration of new internal combustion engines, anything that runs on gasoline or diesel, and that starting at that point, all of them have to be electric vehicles, which is fine and good. In fact, for Metro Manila, I honestly believe that electric vehicles would be suited to our traffic, because every time you step on the brake, you recharge your battery. Now, this is good, except that where will you get all the elements or the minerals that you need to run the electric battery? Nickel is one of those important components, and if I can show you a picture of a graph of the prices of nickel ever since the whole issue started cropping up. Now you can see actually that it's been in the 1980s, it's just $6,500 per metric ton. At its height there, it's 22,910, and then 2022, it's 18,000. I think that's average. But for this year alone, it went up, currently down to 23,000 per metric ton from last month's 26,000, and to a high of $33,900 a year ago. That's a lot, no? And where do you think nickel comes from, no? Nickel is abundant from the core of the earth, and you find them in areas that sort of emerge from the core of the earth, like the Philippines, like Indonesia, no? That are volcanic in nature. Now, this is a picture of, not that one, this one, of a recent controversy in the Philippines. This is Sibuyan Island. Sibuyan Island, for those who do not know, is Galapagos times 10. In fact, I was just talking to one of the mammalogists, no? One of the most reputable or renowned mammalogists in the world. He's the curator at the Field Museum, and he was telling me that there are at least 5 endemic species in Sibuyan Island alone. I'm not even sure if you know where Sibuyan Island is, which is more than any other country in Europe. And yet we only have it in one island. And it's so endemic, it's not found in any other island in the Philippines, notwithstanding the fact that the Philippines is already a biodiversity megastar, no? We're really high up there in the ranking, no? Why? Because we were never part of any. We're in Asia, but the geological history of the Philippines is literally it popped out of the ocean, no? And that's why we have lots of nickel. But this is Sibuyan Island. You think it's just minimal? I don't know if you see yellow dots there. I think to that intersection, those are dump trucks. So now you appreciate the extent of the damage they're illegally doing. It's not even legal. They don't have a license yet. They don't have a permit to do mining yet. And yet, the economic price, the economic value of that commodity is driving companies to engage in these activities, no? And what is driving all that? The need to convert from combustion engines to electric vehicles, no? I'll give you another shift, no? And what is the effect on the community, no? Because this is going to affect their water, this is going to affect the coastal areas, their livelihood, and these are vulnerable sectors, no? Now, I'll give you another example. This one I just got yesterday from the news, no? The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is now so huge and permanent that coastal ecosystem is thriving on it, scientists say. This is another environmental shift because now we realize, OMG, no? For our Spanish counterparts, ODM. Do you know what that means? Oh, Dios mío. So plastics has become a problem, no? And so what we are now doing, we want to phase it out. And if you recall, what was one of the early campaigns on plastics? Let's ban straws. How many of you are now doing away with straws? Do you think that if you go to this garbage patch in the Pacific, you'll see straws? I really doubt it, no? But why did those campaigners and advocates target the straws, no? I really didn't like it, to be honest. And I'm an environmentalist, no, for more than 20 years. I don't like metal straws because it's hard to clean them. So there's a question of hygiene. It leaves an aftertaste, di ba? That metallic aftertaste. Sustainability is an issue for me. Where did you get the metal? Did you mine it? And you know, I hate mining. But more importantly, there's a particular vulnerable sector that's affected by the ban on straws. Those with cerebral palsy, those with Parkinson's or Parkinsonism, they really, and many senior citizens cannot drink on cups, no? And yet many establishments refuse to give them straws because they're already banned. And we don't know why, you know? And they're suggesting that, okay, we let them use straws, but you have to pay for it. But why do they have to pay for that, no? They're vulnerable as it is, and then yet you're making them pay for something that you want just to make yourself feel good about you want a clean environmental conscience, no? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that whenever you have these environmental shifts, whether in the form of what's happening all around us, or because of the policies that we take as a result of our increasing environmental awareness, do not forget about the vulnerable sectors. And it's not just a matter of doing just lip service to them, but actually consulting and asking what is their take on these issues and then their actions that they're going to take. So I leave it there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Attorney Ron Gutierrez. And now we're also going to hear from Professor Mariluz Paris from the University College Dublin on the situation of travelers in Ireland. Professor Mariluz Paris is an associate professor in law at UCD Sutherland School of Law. She is the academic director of the UCD Center for Human Rights, and her primary research interests are in comparative constitutional law, human rights law, European public law, and judicial studies. She has also an interest in legal education, and she held research visiting positions at the University of California, Davis School of Law, and at the Australian National University Centre for European Studies. She holds international recognition and was awarded the Ordre des Palmes Académiques Chevalier rank, the oldest, most prestigious non-military decoration awarded to civilians in France by the French government for her outstanding work on promoting legal research and education between Ireland and France. Marie-Luce received her legal education at the University of Paris II, Panthéon-Assas, France's first law university. She holds 2 masters, both from Paris II. She received the title of Docteur en Droit for her PhD on the implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights by the United Kingdom. Marie-Luce joined UCD Sutherland School of Law to teach in and later direct the BCL Law with French Law and dual degree BCL Maîtrise programs, which aim at training UCD law students to the French civil law system. Marie-Luce teaches on a number of undergraduate and graduate courses, which includes the European Convention on Human Rights, comparative constitutional law, and French public law. Marie-Luce, thank you.
Good morning. I don't know how much time I have, but I wanted to thank everybody again, especially the Ateneo School of Law and the CALESA project organizers. Thank you very much for allowing me to give a second presentation today. So I am aware that my subject today, unlike the one I made yesterday, is a very narrow topic. So yesterday I was talking about freedom of expression, and today I'm talking about the situation or the rights of travelers in Ireland, Irish travelers. So I am aware that it might be a bit anecdotal as a subject, but maybe we can do parallels with other displaced or vulnerable groups of people. I must say at the beginning that I'm not too familiar with this topic. It's not a topic which is actually very much studied in Ireland or anywhere else, I suppose. So there are not many legal experts about the Irish traveler community. It doesn't really interest many people. So what I did to prepare for today is to do some research, but in other fields than law, in sociology studies, in philosophy, in history especially, or even in literature. So there are three important remarks that I would like to make at the beginning. First, Ireland is very small. It's only 5 million people. So is the Irish travelers community. Okay, it's not even 35,000 people. Okay. So, and Irish travelers are not per se displaced persons. They don't travel. They don't travel the world, and they are native. It's a native community in Ireland, and I will explain all the history behind that. So I won't be talking about migrants, because there are migrants in Ireland as well. They are also gypsies, and I will come back to that. But it's different. So migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, for example, Ireland has welcomed a number of Ukrainian refugees, a lot of them actually, compared to other European countries. So I'm not talking about these groups. Anyway, so So again, a bit of an outline. I will give you some demographics, some figures, and some information about the origins of this community. And I hope to give you also some insights of how they are recognized under the Irish legal system. Okay, because I would like to introduce a bit of law. And I will finish by mentioning a case, a very interesting case about education. So I hope you will have an idea, a very broad idea, about these points, the way, what is the Irish travelers community, and the way it's recognized and dealt with, and maybe we can discuss and make parallels with other presentations today. I must say, this is to prepare again for the presentation, I had the idea, because I didn't know anything about it, to do a chat GPT, to ask artificial intelligence to just give me a presentation about Irish travelers. And what I got was about tourists. So that's not what I was looking for, obviously. So, but it's very funny because, they didn't pick the Irish travelers. They just, pick about tourism in Ireland. Anyway, so about demographics, so I was saying this is a map of Ireland, so in case some of you are coming over to the July conference. So this is the Irish travelers, or the Irish traveling community, as it's called, is an ethnic minority group in this country, in the Republic. And they have their own distinct cultures and traditions. And I told you that there were very few of them, so there are 32,000 people over so 0.7% of the population. It's really almost nothing. But it doesn't mean that you don't have to provide for, for them. So, and they are mainly now in urban areas. So I don't know if you know Ireland, but on the east would be Dublin, in the middle of it. Then you have Galway, where there is the dark green. They are in Galway, and a bit down it's Cork. But okay, so there are different cities in Ireland. There are interesting figures as well, but I just don't give them on the slides. about their fertility rate. They make more children than the average population. And when you know that the Irish families are quite big families, you can imagine that the travelers community's families are really big. And they have also, they are very young. So they tend to be younger than the average population. Another interesting fact is, and this can be related maybe to the Philippine diaspora. The Irish, there is a big Irish diaspora in the world, and it's the same for the travelers. For example, in the US, there might be some descendant of the Irish travelers who left the country during the famine in 19th century. So, but the thing is that under US law, they are not recognized as travelers. They are recognized obviously as Irish because they don't count them as, Irish travelers. Now, in terms of origins, they are natives from the island of Ireland, okay? So what I'm saying by that is that there was apparently around the 1600s a split between those people who decided to go nomadic way, not to settle, and to live their life in caravans, and the settled population, okay? But they are both genetically, and I don't like to use these words, but both genetically they are the same, they are native Irish, okay? So they are not gypsies. And gypsies or Roma, I don't know if you know the expressions, Romanishel, Romas. And gypsies are, they are gypsies in Ireland as well, more than actually Irish travelers, 37,000. Gypsies is a deformation of the word Egyptian, because at the origin, the gypsies, they claim that they would be religious refugees from Egypt. Historically, it has been proved, or no, I mean, it has been shown that, in fact, they were coming from India, Indian Aryan origin, the Romas and gypsies, from Punjab provinces and other provinces in India. So, but there are two distinct populations, the Irish native travelers and the gypsies, okay? So I'm just talking about the Irish native travelers, and you will see on the photo that they look, they have very fair hair, very fair skin, and so that's and again, the book I'm citing here is obviously a historical book. It's not obviously a law text. So they call themselves, the Irish travelers, the walking people, and Luchtstuhl in Celtic, in Gaeltacht, and they're also known as the Pavies or the Mincheers. So there are other features which I think are interesting, and obviously the first feature to determine if there is an ethnic group that you can recognize is the language. So that's the next slide. So it's not detailed because I don't see the point in going into many details today, but that's interesting for the parallels we can make. So they have a specific language that they speak. They understand English, obviously, they all speak English, so they are mostly English speaking people. They speak Irish as well, but they have a language of their own, which is called the Shelta, or Cant, which is also spoken by the English travelers, and it's a kind of mixed. It's a very old language, and the funny thing is that nobody cared about this language, so it was kind of discovered in the 18th century, but historians think that it's a much older language, that it goes back to the 13th century. So it might be a very remote language, historically speaking. It's a bit a pity that no research was done, now it's different. But so this is a Shelta, and the interesting thing is that they don't like other people, I mean the settled population, to know about their language. So it's a crypto language, a secret language. So the settled population are not able, they won't teach the settled population their own language, because they fear, and that relates to what I'm going to say later, they fear that if the settled population know their language, they will use it to discriminate against them. So when they speak Shelta, they twist it a bit to make it really weird. So this is what I read, in all the research I made. So this is very interesting to see how this population can actually, protect themselves. Okay, so, well, another important fact is that their work, what they do. So they are historically speaking, they were service providers for the normal, settled population. They were providing trades or tools, or they are called the tinkers because they were providing metals, and they were dealing with horses. The most, this is why there was a picture with a horse at the beginning, because they do horse trading. So that was their main thing. And they would gather with the settled population in fairs. So fairs in the countryside where you had all these people coming with horses, cows, and all that, etc., exchanging. And this is where they would mix with the settled population. So that was good because they get to know each other. Okay, so, and they were also involved in hawking and begging. So that's, another activity, but hawking and begging, you can't, historically there was legislation or laws prohibiting begging. You couldn't beg, it was illegal. But they do hawking so that they can trade something to circumvent the prohibition of begging laws. So they would say, in fact, they were not begging, they were just selling you like flowers or things like that. So this is why they were doing that. But then the problem came, especially in the 50s and 60s, after the Second World War, when agriculture, Ireland is a very agricultural country, a lot of agriculture, not many industries because they are very poor, So after, in the 50s, the tractor replaced the horse, and they were left without economic activity. So this is where, in terms of socially speaking, the travelers were useful, they became useless. And a lot of men in particular, this shifted to criminal activities, so that's a problem. But this was a real problem, because it became, for the settled population, there was no point in their activities. And besides the fairs, there were a lot of fairs, they disappeared. It was not something, now you have shopping malls, you don't have fairs. So that's, a problem, and today they are largely unemployed, okay? And that's a stereotype, that sticks with them. In terms of education, they are less educated than the average population. And I have a figure which is a very sad one. So in the 2016 census of Ireland, there were only 167 travelers, so who went to university over the 30,000. So it's better, but it's not great. So very few of them are educated and to the top level. They go to local schools and primary and secondary, but they don't go to universities. Well, now it's changed. In terms of, and I'm saying all these features, because that will be important in terms of legislation, what can be done. In terms of religion, they are mostly Roman Catholics, which is, as you may know, the main religion in Ireland. But they have a distinct approach to the religion, and again, it has to do with their discrimination. They practice in outside. They practice in the holy wells, in shrines. Why? Because the settled population wouldn't allow them to come to the church, to come inside the church. So the parishes rejected them. So they found ways to practice their religion outside of the churches. So when you think about it, it's a bit sad. And very recently, there was this priest who, at a conference of bishops in Ireland, he advocated for the travelers to be able to actually enter the churches and to be involved in the parishes. But again, you can see that in the 21st century, it's a bit mad to think like that. And then health, again, the same. They have very poor health. And so there was a report, for example, in 2007 that over half of the travelers do not live past 40 years old, okay? And in terms of sports, I think it's important, sports. So as you can see, the two little boys, I don't know if it's quite visible for the blonde one, but they are involved in boxing. So the main sports is boxing, bare knuckle boxing without any gloves. Okay, so that's a tradition. Well, they are doing other activities, obviously. Now, coming to the legal aspect and what has happened, and it's very recent. It's actually very timely to make this presentation, because in the last few years there have been more rights for these people. But when you think that they have been in Ireland for a while, they have been in Ireland forever, and their recognition in law just came about in 2017. So it's a bit crazy. So there have been some stereotypes attached to the travelers. So I'm quoting, a generic traveler figure was typically associated with violence, promiscuity, drunkenness, theft, poverty, cunning, lawlessness, and loquaciousness. They talk a lot. And they were denied their history, and they were completely invisible historically speaking, politically speaking, even though in the arts, in the literature, Irish poets and Irish writers would talk about them, but they were not visible any other way, okay? Now, so in terms of their relations with the Irish state and what happened, so this is the quote, say, they were recognized as an ethnic group in 2017 by the Taoiseach. Taoiseach is the Irish word for the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister at the time, after a big report which was presented to the Parliament, the Dáil, Dáil is the name of the lower chamber, they recognized that the reality of the Irish traveller community, and that it constitutes a distinct ethnic group, okay? And I've put the definition, one of the definitions of the ethnic group, that is a social group or category of population that in the larger society is set apart because they share common ties in terms of language, etc. So that was very welcome, as you can imagine, by the community and by human rights advocates, because they tend, the reason why there is not many lawyers involved, they tend to defend themselves. They don't like other people to deal with their business. So the activists are mostly from the travelers community and not from outside. So this is why, yeah. Now, just to go back a bit in history, before this 2017 date, landmark, the Irish have tried to deal with the issue in many ways. They were not very good, frankly. So Ireland got its independence from the UK in 1922. It became the Irish state, and then it became a republic in 1937. So from 1922, they tried different models. When you want to integrate a population into the main population, what do? You try, either you try to assimilate them, so assimilation, you want them to completely disappear and do the same as the others. So they tried that, and there was a report in 1963, which is a horrible report, treating travelers really, really badly, and because they wanted to assimilate them. So they were, saying basically you don't have the right to live the way you are living. So that was a really bad report. Then they tried from the 60s, from the 70s, they tried integration. Integration is a bit less tough than assimilation, because you want them to integrate, but you don't ask them to actually abandon their, distinctive features. You just don't want to integrate them. And then in the 1990s, they moved towards an intercultural paradigm. So they wanted to, the settled population and the Irish to share their, or to accept the cultural difference with the Irish travelers. And from the 2000 years, from 2000 approximately, they were more towards a specific issues approach. Like, they were dealing with education, they were dealing with, health, they were dealing with mainly that, mainly health and education. That was the most important. But you can see how they have tried over the years to deal with this population. And although there are not too many of them, it has been a huge economic and social problem. The main problem is that they are discriminated against. And you could see, you could see in some, well, I didn't see it myself, but you could see in some pubs or some shops, there are pictures, no travelers allowed inside. So they were clearly discriminated against for, certain things. So no dogs, no travelers, okay? By the way, there was the same for the Irish people in the UK. No dogs, no Irish. Huh? So they have been discriminated, and it's still the case. There was a 2011 report, for example, which reported that these travelers were discriminated against, widespread ostracism against travelers, and that was not good. There was an awareness that this discrimination was not good. So what they did is that they tried to integrate them in the Equal Status Act. So it's a very small character, sorry. But there is this set of legislation from 2000 to 2018. It's a set of legislation about non-discrimination. And one of the grounds of non-discrimination against is to be a member of the Irish traveller community. So you have all the other grounds like you normally have, race, religion, etc., nationality, gender, etc., plus to be a member of the travellers community. So that was a big step because, that recognizes a very specific ground for them. Now, so I'm not detailing any more about the non-discrimination. I just want to mention two things before concluding because I'm aware of the time. Accommodation. This is interesting because I said at the beginning that they don't travel, they don't really move, but they have been allowed, they have the right to accommodation that meets their cultural needs and that respects their way of life. So, and this includes the right to live in a caravan, because this is it used to be a caravan. I don't know how it's called, the other words, but it can be a mobile home or a caravan. So it's a traditional form of accommodation today because they are attached to this way. An interesting quote is that traveling itself is not as important as remaining disposed to travel. So you have in Ireland all these mobile homes and caravans which are, fixed on the grounds with concrete. They will never move, but at least they are in a caravan. They are disposed to move. And that's important for them. They don't like houses. So that respects, their right. And the last thing is about education. There was an interesting case in 2015 for the Supreme Court. That was a case of Mary Stokes and her son. So to give you a picture, I was telling you that Ireland is mainly Catholics. There was this Catholic school, because there is a big demand on generally very nice schools, so this schools was requiring 3 criteria or conditions to enter the school, to be a Catholic, and to, the other one is, so it was Catholics, and that the pupil has attended the local primary school, because this was a secondary school, so they wanted, the boy, John in that case, to have attended a local primary feeder school. And the third requirement was that the child's father or older sibling had attended this secondary school, which was called the Clonmel School. But for travelers whose parents never went into education, that was very difficult to meet. So the mother, Mary, she said that it was an indirect discrimination against the travelers community because, it was unlikely that, their parents, their father would have, it was an old boys school, would have attended. So she went to the Equality Tribunal, and to claim, that he was discriminated against. And the Equality Tribunal accepted that, so that she was discriminated. I mean, our son was discriminated against, and the Supreme Court in the 2015 ruling, so the Supreme Court in Ireland is the highest court, obviously, and dealing with questions of law, and they were not really, I mean, they, how do you say, they dismissed the appeal of Mary because they were not provided with enough evidence that he was discriminated against. So I don't think it's a very satisfactory judgment, but they were not satisfied with this. So this is, and the last point is now, politically speaking, the travelers community has a word, their participation recognized in decision-making process, which was not the case before, so they can participate in local government at national level. So this is all what I have to say about this, topic. It's just that despite, and by way of conclusion, I would say that despite all these legal protections, which are in place now, very recently, they still face, big discrimination socially, economically speaking. And I think this is really a change of mentality that needs to happen. So I will stop now, and I will. I have also a set of references. Again, there are good websites and things like that. And an important thing, because I understand we are going to visit the Commission on Human Rights here. So there is the equivalent in Ireland, the Irish Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is a very interesting website if you want to know more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marie-Luz. We'll have a break for 10 minutes. I hope that's fine that we're shortening it to 10, but you can bring your coffee or other refreshments into the hall afterwards. We'll expect you to be back at 10:40. Thank you.
Pwede ba natin igalaw to? Hindi. Hindi, pero si Sedge muna. Si Sedge, hindi pa ako. Si Sedge pa. Mamaya na lang. Para lang makita ko yung, ano, hindi pa ako si Sedge pa. Hindi ako na lang. Okay na ako para mas kontrolado ko yung ano. Dito? Dito? Oh, katabi ko lang naman to eh. So, gaganyan lang ako. Ang problema ko lang ay, sige, mamaya na lang.
Hello again and good morning. We will be resuming the morning session of today's conference, and our next speaker is Attorney Cecilia Jimenez Damari, who will be talking about her paper entitled Issues and Challenges Faced by Internally Displaced Persons in the Philippines. So Attorney Jimenez Damari was appointed Special Rapporteur on Human Rights on Internally Displaced Persons by the Human Rights Council in September 2016 and assumed the mandate on the 1st of November 2016. Since the IDP mandate was created in 1992, her appointment marked the first time a woman was appointed and the first from Asia. She finished her 6-year term just last October 2022. And she is also, of course, a lawyer in human rights and international humanitarian law, specializing in forced displacement and migration. She has over 3 decades of experience in NGO human rights advocacy for the Asia-Pacific region and teaching experience as an adjunct professor of international human rights and humanitarian law. And we hear that she will also be teaching transitional justice in another university. Attorney Jimenez Damari previously acted as Senior Legal Advisor and Trainer with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, or IDMC, of the Norwegian Refugee Council, or NRC, in Geneva, and as the National Director of the IDP Project of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, as well as the Government Representative to the Philippine Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission for the Bangsamoro. She holds an LLM degree in Public International Law from King's College London, in the UK, of course, an MDC or Management Development Certificate in International Organizations, and an MBA from the University of Geneva in Switzerland, a Bachelor of Laws degree from Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service from the University of the Philippines. She was admitted to the bar in 1990. Let's welcome Attorney Jimenez Damari.
Magandang umaga po sa inyo lahat. Thank you very much. Good morning, buenos dias, bonjour. I hope I didn't forget any language. I'm very pleased to be here in my capacity as a former UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. And in fact, thank you very much to Ateneo and the organizers of this seminar for having invited me and to provide you, hopefully not more than 30 minutes, as has been mandated in the program, a presentation on the issues and challenges facing internally displaced persons in the Philippines. I think it's very important for us to situate ourselves with regard to IDPs. I started work, which I didn't know what I was getting into. When I was a youngish human rights lawyer working for a broad coalition of human rights organizations in the Philippines, and I was given a dossier, and this was way back in 1991, 1992, to go to Marag Valley, which took us about 8 hours of traveling from Manila by land and crossing rivers and crossing fields to find a group of people in Marag Valley who was hiding from the bombings of the government of the Philippines to flush out the communist insurgency in Cagayan. And we stayed with them for 5 days in the cave beside the river, living with them. And the reason we went to look for them is because we were informed by the church in Cagayan province that there was this group of people who could not get out of the danger zones because they were very much afraid of leaving. And obviously, they were also being targeted. And I went back to Marag Valley to be with these people, I think 3 times, precisely not only to deliver with other people, of course, humanitarian assistance, but also to get affidavits from them concerning their internal displacement and the war, the internal war that was happening in that area. obviously, those affidavits were very useful because the Congress eventually called for a hearing on the plight of the people in Marag Valley. We call them internal refugees. And this was at the time that internally displaced persons as a term did not exist. So eventually, that was really my first exposure to IDPs, as we call now. Unfortunately, it's always been the same again and again. When one encounters IDPs, they're always vulnerable precisely because of their displacement. Secondly, they suffer from deprivation of human rights guarantees, food, shelter, of course, because they had to be they were forced to flee. Food, shelter, the education of the children, standard of living, and a lot of them were also being discriminated. So I encountered the situation of the vulnerability of internally displaced persons in the more than 30 countries that I traveled to as a special rapporteur on the human rights of IDPs, and in all continents of the world, except, of course, the Arctic and Antarctica. But what is very much emphatic about their situation is that these people have been deprived of their human rights and the guarantees under international humanitarian law precisely because of their displacement. Let me just give you a snapshot of the figures at the end of 2021 with regard to IDPs worldwide. Unfortunately, the data coming from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center on the number of IDPs in 2022 are not yet ready. They actually come out end of May. So we'll have to do with the figures of the end of 2021. And and their data really sees that over 60 million of people around the world are actually considered internally displaced persons in 53 countries. And why were they displaced? The main thing is actually two important triggers. One is armed conflict and violence, and the second are disasters. So this figure of 60 million people are the IDPs who remain displaced at the end of the year. However, there were more people who were displaced by disasters, and I'm very happy that there was already a discussion earlier on about the climate change induced displacement. More people are displaced by disasters all over the world, but the trend is they are able to go back to their homes in a much faster manner. Less people were displaced by armed conflict. However, people who were displaced by armed conflict and violence are actually, most of them remain in displacement towards the end of the year. So that is how we count IDPs. And why is this? Because people who were displaced by armed conflict and violence still experience a lot of insecurity and human rights violations before, during, and after displacement. I also would like to say that we have an unknown number of people who were displaced because of development projects. And this is really underestimated, and a lot of people do not understand that actually people displaced by mining, hydroelectric projects, and I'll talk more about this later on with regard to the Philippines, they are also internally displaced persons. And in fact, what I did was, because this was such an underestimated and understated trigger for forced internal displacement, my last report to the UN General Assembly, which I gave and delivered last October, in New York was about development-induced displacement. So if any of you have interest in that, you are very free. It's on the internet of the United Nations. Lastly, in terms of the worldwide internal displacement situation, I also would like to insist that COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021 also caused at least 1 million new displacements due to armed conflict, however, also connected with the COVID situation. Okay, so let's go to the legal framework on internal displacement, because we had a discussion this morning about some displaced persons. We will have a discussion later on about migrants, and we also had a discussion preceding my speech about travelers. But I would like to have a very, very clear legal understanding of who is an internally displaced person. The descriptive definition provides that they are, of course, persons or group of persons, that's easy enough, who have been forced or obliged to flee or leave their homes or places of habitual residence. So what is very important in this particular case is forced or obliged. It's not voluntary. No sense of voluntariness, which therefore already excludes many of the migrant community, migrant workers or migrant settlers who displaced themselves or moved because they wanted to and they had the ability to do so. But forced or obliged actually also have very specific legal nuances. Force can be physical. For example, a person who is in an armed conflict situation or a violent situation, and they were forced to flee. I'll give you an example that I encountered in Libya. In the Benghazi, the warlord there was basically forcing people who were against his regime to go to West Libya. And so they were really forced and they did not want to leave. However, if they did not leave, they would die. They would be killed. I was speaking to this Libyan man who said 2 of his brothers were already killed for resisting efforts by the government to kick them out of Benghazi. But they can also be obliged to flee. And that is, there is no physical force or physical threat of force, but they do understand that if they remain, they may suffer insecurities. And I've already come across 2 cases of families who displaced themselves because of red tagging. This is in the Philippines. For our friends from abroad, red tagging is when you are accused of being a communist or an insurgent, and therefore you're on some kind of a list as a targeted person by the government. So oblige or forced to leave are very important legal elements of forced internal displacement. But why do they leave? And these are the contexts that I would actually be going through when I'll be speaking about the Philippines. The first one is as a result or to avoid. So avoid is a little bit like the oblige. To avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of armed violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. And very importantly, guys, they have not left the country. They did not cross an internationally recognized border. Because what happens if they cross an internationally recognized state border? They become migrants, or they may even become refugees or asylum seekers. I encountered some families from the Marawi siege. As you know, in 2017, there was an attempt by the Daesh or the ISIL through the Mauti group to take over our Islamic city in Mindanao. And then the government responded by bombardment. And we had a lot of 150,000 IDPs at least who had to flee Marawi city. And some of those people, a few, have already left the Philippines to become migrant workers mostly in Saudi Arabia. I'm not, well, first of all, they are not anymore considered IDPs because you can only be considered IDPs while you're in the country. Nevertheless, you may have some rights as IDPs that may still be judicially or parajudicially accounted for. For example, if you left property in Marawi that was destroyed, even though you're abroad, you left it because you were an IDP, and it's just a matter of development that you are abroad right now. And this was something I had to explain to the Marawi Compensation Board because they're now in the process of finalizing their implementing rules and regulation. So the definition was actually brought up in 1998 through the promulgation by my very, very first mandate holder, Professor Francis Deng. And these are the guiding principles on internal displacement. It has been translated in many, many languages, and that is actually the legal framework that we are now using with regard to what are the rights of internally displaced persons. It's actually the most authoritative legal framework on the rights of IDPs, legal rights, both under international human rights and IHL, and it's the 20th anniversary this year, joining the rest of the anniversaries being commemorated in 2023. Now, it's a soft law framework because it's a restatement of applicable international human rights law and IHL guarantees. However, over time, over 25 years, we can safely say that even though the framework, as a legal framework, is actually considered soft law, many of the principles therein are actually either jus cogens or even hard law, depending on the treaty obligations of the state concerned. So in the Philippines, we're a little bit more lucky in a way, because the Republic of the Philippines has actually signed and ratified many of the human rights treaty that actually covers internally displaced persons as well. So here's an internal snapshot on the snapshot on the internal displacement in the Mindanao area, which is where I live. This is as of October 22, and we have UN agencies that deal with data on displacement. And here you will see that Mindanao has always been like a focus on internal displacement in the Philippines because that's where majority of IDPs are. So, but this is just a snapshot, but what I would like to do is actually go and to have a little bit more of explanation with regard to the triggers of internal displacement. The first is obviously armed conflict. Armed conflict in the Philippines, yes, they still exist. Especially to our foreign friends, we have the longest running communist insurgency in the world, and they're mainly in the Visayas and in Mindanao, and of course military operations go on as well as operations in the what we call the SPMS box because of the small groups that that split off from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So so in terms of non-state armed groups, we've got the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army, and in Mindanao, the different little groups that have split off. And of course, we've got legacies of the Marawi siege of 2017 and the Zamboanga siege, which was instigated by another Moro group, the Moro Nationalist Liberation Front. This was in 2013. And even though Marawi and Zamboanga have finished, however, we still have legacies of internal displacement there. So the situation in Mindanao actually accounted for, in 2021, as usual, to be the largest displacement in the Philippines because of armed conflict. Armed conflict is very much covered by international humanitarian law. Don't get me wrong, because this is a very important lex specialis that, of course, covers any situation of armed conflict, but as you and I know, human rights also still apply to them. That's a non-brainer. But we also have what we call violence. Violence meaning it has not really reached the threshold of international law, of an armed conflict, but violence that can be communal, and mostly it is communal. In Mindanao, we have RIDO, and these are the different little conflicts and violent conflicts between families because of land, which is a big problem in Mindanao. In the Cordillera, we also have some intercommunal violence, and as well as in eastern, western, and central Visayas. Unfortunately, we don't hear much about these, but this is the reality of displacement in the Philippines. At the end of, these are IDMC data, at the end of around mid-2022 last year, around 120,000 were still living in displacement across the country as a result of conflict and violence. And many of these were actually the Marawi conflict, the Marawi siege legacy, if you want. I was in Marawi just a month ago, and I'm afraid that although some people have been able to return, some have resettled elsewhere, there will be permanent displacement of at least 4 barangays in Marawi City. And why was this? We were all shocked that because now they're allowing people to come back, we were all shocked because 4 barangays in ground zero of Marawi have been built on by a stadium, a convention center, a mosque that nobody goes to, barangay halls when there are no barangays, no people in the area, and other showcases, infrastructure showcases. So my first question was, where will the people live? And the answer was, we will create a new barangay for them, which was the subject of the last Marawi elections less than a month ago. So it's permanent displacement. And basically, a lot of the IDPs were, of course, not very happy, to say the least, because they were not really consulted with regard to what they called rehabilitation. So that's armed conflict situation and violence in Mindanao. And of course, Marawi was a low-intensity, non-international armed conflict. The communist insurgency remains a high-intensity, non-international armed conflict. The second cause is human rights violations. And human rights violations can be anything. The beauty of the descriptive definition in the guiding principles on internal displacement is that it's all very inclusive. So we have had cases of a lot of violence as well, but more because of human rights violations. When I was special rapporteur, I encountered a case I spoke to Indonesia, and this was a case in Aceh, where a mob, a community mob, with the collusion of the Sharia government of Aceh, chased out transgender people from Aceh, and they had to relocate themselves to the capital. In my view, and I really put it down as a decision, this is a case of forced internal displacement, primarily because of human rights violation, but also, with the methodology or with the method of violence. I also encounter a lot of evictions, and we have that in the Philippines. Housing evictions is unfortunately something that's easily done in the Philippines, and most of them without due process. So without due process, then therefore it automatically converts to a human rights violation. And unfortunately, this is not just in the Philippines. Human rights violations can also be not only with regard to individual people, it can also be concerning communal rights. In India, I encountered a case of generations of people, I mean, they lived in this forest for generations, and the Supreme Court of India ordered their removal for conservation purposes of the forest. So we were able to, with other special rapporteurs, we were able to stop that for a while, and the case is now being reconsidered. I mentioned red tagging. It's very small, at least as far as I know, it's only been 2 families. But will one consider that as a forced internal displacement? I would say yes, because they felt themselves, they had to oblige themselves to leave, otherwise they will be targeted. So, okay, so we've gone through 2 of the important triggers, armed conflict and violence. And violence, by the way, sorry, let me just go back, can also be done by non-state actors. It's not just the government, as you know. And of course, human rights violations. Now let's go to disaster displacement. Disaster displacement in terms of, moving of people, this is the internationally accepted definition. Disaster displacement refers to situations where people are forced, again, the forced element, are forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence as a result of a disaster or in order to avoid the impact of an immediate and foreseeable natural hazard. Now, the definition of disaster displacement only came in around a decade ago when, as you know, the guiding principles on internal displacement was adopted in 1998. So it's very obvious that there has been a progressive interpretation of the law in this. And disaster displacement is not a small thing. In 2021, the disasters triggered in the Philippines 5.7 million internal displacement. Storms accounted for 91%. We know Odette, that led to the largest number of disaster displacement of the year worldwide, and there were small disasters as well, small but really affecting people in terms of floods, in terms of earthquakes, and also, well, the year before that, we also had Taal volcano, right? So the Philippines, being in the Pacific Rim of Fire, is unfortunately a recipient of all these disasters. In 2021, we had 415,000 homes across the archipelago were damaged, and 1.7 million IDPs' livelihoods were also disrupted. And now we just had another storm, and so now we have new data coming up with regard to people who had been displaced and had to suffer homelessness, lack of livelihood, etc., etc. And of course, insecurity. So as a result of disaster displacement in 2021, we had almost 600,000 people still displaced as of December. The Philippines also experiences significant rainfall, as I said, going to flood displacements, and they usually take place during the southwest monsoon season that we have. The overall figure in 2021 was 9 times higher than in 2020. So one has to sort of think about, where's the disaster risk management program in the Philippines, when we all know we are supposed to have one of the best responses to mitigate natural hazards? I can't give you the answer to that. I'm sorry. Now, what is unaccounted for, because so far I've been talking about disaster displacement in terms of in terms of sudden onset displacement. What about slow onset? We don't have the data in the Philippines compared to data in the Americas and Africa. Nobody seems to care. And I think this is a very important aspect, because I do know that there are some towns which are experiencing slow level rise of water, and they have had to close the town. I remember that I saw pictures of people having the last mass in that little town that had to be evacuated permanently, and they were having mass while they were in the boats, because that was their goodbye mass to the town. So in 2019, I made a report to the General Assembly on slow onset effects of climate change hazards and internally displaced persons. If you're into this topic, again, you're welcome to look at that. Okay, last but not the least, our development projects in the Philippines for our foreign friends. We call them development aggression. It came about during the time of the Chico Dam River, which maybe some of the students here were not even born at the time, but that was the first major movement against a big project of Marcos Sr., who was planning to do a big dam in the Cordilleras, and it was also like a trigger for the Cordillera People's Army. So why are we having this discussion right now? Because unfortunately, from last year to this year, to last administration, until this administration, we do have, I believe, a policy of the promotion of extractive industries, including open mining and other forms of development aggression, including dams, build, and other infrastructure. Aside from the Chico River Dam, which was already shelved, and when I was talking with the World Bank, they were telling me that it was because of the Chico River Dam that they came up with rules and regulations about how to mitigate displacement in the projects that they were supposed to be funding. But fast forward to the present, we've got, I think a while ago it was mentioned, the Sibuyas Islands, the Romblon mining. We've got the Kaliwa Dam in Quezon, okay, and this is being fought against by indigenous peoples. And, but there is some hope, I have to tell you. You may have heard about the Tampakan case in South Cotabato, which was a subject of a report by my predecessor, Professor Biani, when he visited the Philippines. And that has stopped right now because the local government, the local government of the province of Cotabato basically said we don't want open pit mining. So there is still some hope, but unfortunately there is sometimes a collusion by local government units with the national, and sometimes business, unfortunately, trumps all the time. But these are very live issues to the people, particularly indigenous peoples, who are being threatened with this. So indigenous peoples are, of course, one of, and I think you'll be talking about them later on Saturday. Okay, vulnerable populations. In all of these situations, we've got vulnerable populations. All of these groups have specific rights attached to them. Children, persons with disabilities, women, the elderly. I'm very happy that one of the previous speakers has spoken about persons with disabilities and the elderly. That also applies in displacement. You have to flee. I mean, some people were killed in Marawi because they couldn't flee, or they just said, we'll just stay here because it was difficult for them to move. And all of these vulnerable groups have to be looked at not only because of their vulnerability, but because they have specific rights attached to their situation. I made a report on, sorry, I keep on talking about my reports, but I was able to make a research on children IDPs and the rights of children IDPs with UNICEF. And now I'm very happy that it's now being used by many of the UN agencies. Unfortunately, I don't know if the Philippine government is using it, but it seems that it's always difficult to use specific rights attached to specific groups. Persons with disabilities have really suffered a lot. And of course, women. So women, I think we have advanced a little bit more, because particularly now when women are displaced, we always have safe places for them, and particularly women who are pregnant and are also breastfeeding. So more and more, they are also being taken care of, and the government is very much aware of that. But we need to really up the level with regard to persons with disabilities and elders. Challenges, my last PowerPoint is we have to take note that IDPs in the Philippines are mostly in non-camp settings. We don't have the big IDP camps that I have encountered, for example, in Africa. They're mostly at home, and or they may be in what we call transitional housing. When did Haiyan happen? Yolanda was 2013. We still have 3 transitional housing groups in Tacloban. There are still IDPs in there. So the transitional has become permanent. So if you consider that these are the settings, we must look at really challenges, because it's not really camp management that we're looking at, but really the local government units, the importance that they have in hosting these IDPs. The first one is IDP participation. That is not only a human right, and actually it's a necessity when you want to be efficient and competent into the response of government. Remember that the state is primarily in charge, responsible for the rights of IDPs. But IDP participation is needed, and I gave you the story about Marawi, and that's really something that it's scandalous, if I may say. The legal framework, the legal framework, we're supposed to have a Philippine IDP bill. I don't know if there's somebody from the Commission on Human Rights here, but they have been working for more than a decade on having a bill that will protect the rights of IDPs in the Philippines, that will also criminalize arbitrary displacement. That bill was filed at a time when the Secretary of the Human Rights Committee of the House of Representatives was pregnant. Guess how old the boy is now? He's 15 years old. So we actually measure the length of this saga by the age of the son of the Secretary of the Human Rights Committee of the House of Representatives. It's still languishing in Congress. Third, accountability, very important, because I'll just tell you an anecdote. Marawi, some lawyers are actually questioning, was the bombardment in that proportion necessary under IHL law that caused the displacement of thousands of IDPs and destruction of houses and buildings? And so if you're going to apply IHL here, it's a low intensity NIAC, nevertheless, there are certain rules that will have to be looked at. Fourth is transitional justice, including compensation. We have a little window now in the Marawi Compensation Bill, whereby they will give compensation to destroyed buildings and houses, but it's only really compensation. I was telling them, I'm advising them that they will have a big role as well in the right to truth, but it's just sort of an incidental pillar on transitional justice for IDPs. Last but not the least, durable solutions. What do we do with the over 100,000 people who are still displaced and will remain displaced? And durable solutions is, of course, always a challenge in all situations of protracted displacement. Maraming salamat po at shukran.
Thank you, Sedge. We've so far had 3 very relevant and insightful presentations, and we're moving to our 4th speaker, Attorney Marlon Manuel, who's also a professor at the Ateneo, for his presentation entitled Issues and Challenges Affecting In-Country Workers. Marlon is the Senior Advisor for Legal Empowerment Network of NAMATI, which is a legal empowerment organization dedicated to advancing justice by equipping people to know, use, and shape the laws that affect them. Marlon has more than 2 decades of experience in legal empowerment work, having devoted practically his entire career to social justice and human rights lawyering. He has combined grassroots education activities with active involvement in strategic litigation on human rights and public interest issues, public reform work on social justice legislation, and justice system reform programs on improving access to justice. From 2008 to 2017, Marlon was the coordinator of the Alternative Law Group, or ALG, a coalition of 20 legal resource NGOs in the Philippines with distinct programs that are primarily concerned with the pursuit of public interest, respect for human rights, and promotion of social justice. Before joining NAMATI, he served as member of the Global Legal Empowerment Network's Guidance Committee. Marlon, as I've earlier mentioned, is a professor at the Ateneo Law School, where he received his Juris Doctor degree in 1994. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in Management, major in Legal Management, from the College of Arts and Sciences of the same university, and was most recently a bar examiner for labor law of the Philippine National Bar Exam. Please welcome Attorney Manuel.
Thank you, Pat. Magandang umaga po. Good morning, everyone. I always, every time there are foreigners in any venue, in any event, I always explain that in the Philippines, when we say good morning, we don't use the word good. We use the word maganda, which is beautiful. Beautiful morning, beautiful afternoon, beautiful evening, and sometimes you have to respond. And you say you are more beautiful than the morning. Mas maganda ka pa sa umaga, or mas maganda ka pa sa hapon, right? So, good morning, maganda umaga, beautiful morning, everyone. We have a few visiting participants from other countries. We'll be talking, among other things, the airport. I'm sure you have experienced our airport. Boracay. I hope you will have the the opportunity to visit Boracay, and we'll talk about the iconic Philippine jeepney, among other issues. Okay, before we go to the topic, let us look at a broader context, the employment situation in the Philippines, and I'll try to explain briefly the statistics that we have. And these are the latest employment statistics released only a few days ago, April 11. But the statistics covered, the survey covered February, the second month of the year, 2023. We start with the top category, and this is the base population. So take note that this is not the total population of the Philippines. We are 110 million now, unfortunately, 110 million. So this counts only those who are 15 years old and over. Okay, so it's a smaller number, 77 million. So that's the base. And interestingly, it excludes OFWs, or Filipino migrant workers working in other countries. So the 77 million would not include the OFWs. Okay, so that's the base. From that base of 77 million, we go to what is called as the labor force. These are those who are capable, willing, able to work. But they include the unemployed. Okay? Just to clarify the terms that they are using. So the survey is being conducted before it used to be with the BLES, the Bureau of Labor Employment Statistics, but now it's the PSA, the Philippine Statistics Office. I don't know if there's anybody here from the PSA who is handling all statistics, including labor statistics, employment statistics. So out of the 77 million Filipinos, 66.6% is what is called as the labor force participation rate. So 66.6% would be considered as your working population. Okay? So this, in terms of exact figures, we have 51.27 million Filipinos who are excluded. So aside from the OFWs who are excluded here, those who are not looking for work because of a number of reasons. One, they are studying. So if they are in school, they are not part of they are not part of the labor force. So they are not part of the 51.27. So that's the reason for the reduction from 77 to 51.27 million. If you're already retired, then you are no longer looking for work. So you are excluded from the labor force. So that's the reason for the reduction. So the employment figures will be based on that second tier, the 51.27 million. So based on that number, out of the 51.27 million, 48.80 million are employed. So this is as of February. This is not an average full year. As of February, so we have a 95.2% employment rate. However, if you look at the fourth category, there is a big number of workers who are employed but are considered as underemployed. And there is a technical meaning for underemployment. This does not refer to the mismatch between your capacity, your skills, and the job. It's not about that. It's about the hours of work. You are underemployed if you are currently employed, but you want to do more hours of work in your current job. Or you want an additional job. Or you want a new job because you want more hours of work. So this also translates to compensation. If you have more hours, then you will have a bigger income. So there's a big number, and that is 12.9%, almost 13% of those who are employed. And this is a significant chunk of the employed workers. Then we go to the unemployed. So again, we go back to the 51.27 million, the labor force. Out of the 51.27 million, 4.8 is the unemployment rate. So that translates to 2.47 million individuals. Just to compare, for comparison with previous data, in 2022, the full year unemployment rate was 5.4%. Okay, so this is a little improvement from the full year. But take note, that was a full year, the full year figures for 2022. And in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, the unemployment rate was 10%. So imagine that, 10% at that time. So now it's 2.47 million. In the next few months, level 2 will increase. That will certainly happen. Why? Anybody? Any guess? What is expected to happen in the next few months? Graduation. Graduation. Graduation, not the bar oath taking. Graduation. College graduates will then transfer from the base population, from those excluded from the second, they will now add to the 51.27 million. Immediately. They will now be, so remember the explanation earlier, that if you are in school, you are not looking for work, then you are not part of the 51.27 million. Now, if you graduate, and we are not only referring to college graduates, we're referring to graduates also of graduates of grade 12, because many of them will not go to college and will look for work. So we are looking at graduation as a significant event. So this will shift. So it will be interesting to look at the figures for the second quarter. The unemployment rate is expected to increase. So don't be surprised if there will be a sudden increase in the unemployment rate. That is because of the graduation of students. So we will have an increase in the 51.27 million. So that's the overall situation. That's the context of the unemployment or the employment situation in the Philippines. That's our given. So now we will focus on a situation where those who are already employed will then be transferred to the unemployed category. Okay? Not because of graduation, not because of the changing in the base population, but you have jobs, you have a job, and then eventually you will lose that job. That will be our topic for this session. And okay, some would call it worker displacement. So if we are discussing displacement, this is specific to the loss of the job. Earlier, we had Special Rapporteur Sedge referring to IDPs, referring to different triggers for displacement. Those triggers will also affect workers. Okay? Workers also lose jobs because of conflict, because of disasters, because of other issues mentioned earlier. But here, we will be specific to losing your job because of the causes that we will be identifying later. There are different terms used. Worker displacement, job displacement, worker dislocation, and the more commonly used terms, mass layoff, or retrenchment, downsizing, or simply dismissal of a significant number of workers, a significant number of employees. A clarification that while the terms layoff, retrenchment, downsizing usually apply to the context of an industrial or commercial enterprise, meaning workers with a direct employer-employee relationship in the industrial or commercial sector, our discussion today will also include informal sector workers, agricultural workers. Okay, so I will identify specifically at certain points what applies to the formal sector employees, the informal sector workers, agricultural workers, or industrial workers. We will look at 5 items. First, we will look at the causes of worker displacement. And then from the causes, we will go to factors that contribute to that displacement. Again, different from the factors that had been mentioned earlier by Attorney Sedge. And then we will look at impacts and the different levels of effects, adverse effects of worker displacement. And then we will look at governmental policy in terms of regulation, in terms of responses, what programs are available and implemented. And then finally, we will look at adjustment measures that could work if implemented properly. Let's start with the causes. We will cover 3 key causes. 1, economic causes. Number 2, policy-related disruptions. And I will explain what we mean by policy-related disruptions. And number 3, development-induced displacement, which is related to what Attorney Sedge referred to earlier as development aggression or development of big-ticket projects. Let's start with economic reasons. This could be because of a regional situation. The Asian financial crisis in 1997 would be a good example. Or global, the global financial crisis of 2008. Every 10 years, no, we always have a major event. Or it could be specific to a particular country, the Philippines or Sri Lanka or Sudan now experiencing economic crisis triggered by different causes. Or it could be specific to a particular company, independent of the financial situation. Independent of the financial situation in the country, in the region, or globally. There could be company-induced displacements. And this can be the result of a number of factors. One could be relocation. Periodically, in the Philippines, we have seen garments factories moving to other countries, to Vietnam primarily. Every so often, every 5 years, every 10 years, we have big garments factories closing down their business in the Philippines and moving to other countries, Vietnam, Cambodia. Reorganization, company reorganization could also result to displacement of workers, bankruptcy, financial situation, financial difficulties of companies, changes in demand in terms of consumer preference, consumer demand. Technology is also a trigger that could cause reorganization, which eventually would cause dismissal of employees, and many other reasons that could be considered by an employer, establishment, by a company, to close down the business or to reduce significantly its personnel complement. Let us take the case of Hanjin Shipyard. Anybody from Zambales, Bataan? Here, Hanjin Shipyard was operated by Hanjin Industries and Construction Company. It started its operations in the Philippines in 2006. It's a Korean company, and the shipyard was the fourth largest globally. Okay, the shipyard in Zambales. So it started in 2006. At the peak of its operations, it employed about 30,000 workers, mostly from the provinces of Bataan and Zambales. So this is close to Olongapo City, Subic. What happened? In 2019, it went bankrupt and then laid off workers. Imagine that at the peak, it had 30,000. The company owed $400 million to 5 Philippine banks and $900 million more to Korean lenders. So imagine the effect on workers displaced. Recently, this news report was a recent news item, March of this year. And the workers, the former workers of Hanjin, were complaining against a potential eviction from a housing project that was built by the company when Hanjin was still operational. So they were laid off, and then they defaulted on the amortizations, and now they're being kicked out. So the effects of the closure of Hanjin in 2019 is still a live issue until today. And the rehabilitation of the area is still live. I think part of the area is being used by the Navy. Part of it was sold or being rented out by a different company. So that's an example. And in a country like the Philippines, losing thousands of jobs, and specifically for a small community, is a significant event. It's a major displacement. Let us look at policy-related disruptions, and we will use 3 examples. One is Boracay. I said earlier, we will be talking about Boracay, the closure and rehabilitation of the Boracay Island. And then second, the jeepney modernization program. And then third, the COVID-19 policies. And I will explain why I am putting COVID-19 policies under policy-related issues. For those who are not familiar, in 2018, under the administration of former President Duterte, there was an order to shut down Boracay Island. Because of pollution, because of the need to rehabilitate the island, it was closed for 6 months. Rehabilitation continues until today, but there was a total closure of Boracay Island for 6 months. And you can imagine the number of tourists who were supposed to be there, the number of establishments, hotels, restaurants, all the services and the items that are being sold, being transacted in the island stopped for 6 months. In fact, that was a good practice for the Department of Labor, preparatory to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because that 6-month closure of Boracay led to the issuance of some policies specific to a 6-month government-mandated closure that eventually the Department of Labor adopted during the COVID for the quarantine rules. So if you compare the policy issuances of the Department of Labor during the pandemic and the Boracay closure, they're very similar provisions. So this was an example. Another example is the jeepney modernization. Just a few weeks ago, we had a nationwide strike by jeepney operators and drivers organizations nationwide because of a government plan to modernize the jeepney. Supposedly as part of the government's transition program to a more sustainable use. But there are many problems with implementation. In some, this would cause livelihood, the jobs of the jeepney drivers and the jeepney operators. The government has, as far as I know, temporarily suspended or delayed the modernization program. So this is an example of a policy-induced displacement. Next, of course, is COVID. And why are we considering this as a policy-induced disruption? Because the Philippines is quite unique in terms of the policies that were issued during the pandemic. We had the longest quarantine and multiple variants. So we had multiple variants of the virus. We also had multiple variants of the quarantine levels. I lost track of the different types of quarantines, community quarantines. We also had the longest lockdown of schools. Face-to-face classes resumed only last year, right? Only for this school year, right? So it was a very long period of quarantine, and there were prohibitions for, aside from the total lockdown in the first few months of 2020, there were different levels of quarantines that allowed very limited operation of establishments that are very limited. So not full capacity, some are 50%, some are even less than 50%. So this affected employment of workers in those establishments. In 2020, November, there was a survey commissioned by the World Bank with the Department of Finance and the National Economic and Development Authority. It was a survey of 13,878 companies. Okay, it's a sizable amount. A sample size was clear, and it was it benefited from historical data from a previous survey that was conducted in August. So they were comparing the April to July 2020 period with the July to November period. So they were assessing the impacts of COVID-19 on different establishments. So as you can see, this, just to explain the term, by extensive margin, we're referring to actual jobs, okay? Whether you employ or you dismiss employees, as opposed to reduction of hours of work, which is referred to as the intensive margin. So extensive margin, so only 3% of the firms surveyed increased their employment, increased the number of employees in the second period from July to November. And if you look at the figures, there is a significant percentage of firms who had decreased their employees. Okay? Almost half in the first period from April to July, and then 38% in the period July to November. So there were the survey results clearly showed downward adjustments in terms of employment, in terms of the number of personnel in those establishments. There was an improvement in the second period, but still significant in terms of the percentage in the firms. Now, another significant table. These are employment adjustments in relation to the conditions of work. So this is not really hiring or termination. So if you look at the last two items, again, a sizable percentage of firms said that they either reduced the number of hours of their workers or reduced the wages of their employees. There are other policy-induced displacements that we can give as examples. The K-12 program resulted into in the displacement of personnel of educational institutions at the time when it was there was a transition period. Suspension of mining operations during the time of President Aquino, that also caused the displacement of workers. So again, when we talk about policy-induced displacements, this would have nothing to do with the economic situation, but referring to policies imposed by government. I'm worried about Mindoro because of the oil spill. They had suspended fishing. There are talks about suspension of the operations of establishments in Puerto Galera because of the oil spill. That would also result in the displacement of hundreds or thousands of workers in Mindoro. Okay, let's go to the third category, development-induced displacement. And this is related to what was mentioned earlier as development aggression. We will cover two examples, the mega projects, and number two, the massive conversion of agricultural lands. For the mega projects, we can cite two clear examples. One is the new Manila Airport, which will be outside Manila. It will be in my home province in Bulacan, in the municipality of Bulacan. So it's in Bulacan with a K, in the province of Bulacan with a C. That's close to the bay. Okay, that's close to the bay. So it will cover more than 2,500 hectares of property in Bulacan. To be fair, the airport will create jobs. From the time of construction, which had started apparently, up to the time when the airport is now will be operational, they say 2027. I doubt that. 2020, based on our experience, I don't think the airport will be operational by 2027. So it will create jobs, but we have to be mindful that the project itself will also displace workers. Fisher folks had been displaced. Communities had been relocated. They were given compensation, apparently, but the livelihoods, the disruption in their livelihoods, in their lives, should be considered as significant changes. Another example, and this was mentioned by Sedge earlier, the Kaliwa Dam. Another mega project. It is called the new Centennial Water Source, the Kaliwa Dam. A 12 billion peso project. It is a project of the Metropolitan Water Works and Sewerage System. It is primarily intended to augment the supply for Metro Manila. Okay, so every time we hear of reports about shortage, I couldn't help but link it to shortage of water in Metro Manila. I couldn't help but link it to the Kaliwa Dam project. It's being used as justification for the Kaliwa Dam project. The dam will be located in Quezon, specifically in two municipalities, General Nakar and Infanta. But there will be a long tunnel that will be built from the dam's location in Quezon all the way to Teresa Rizal, which is close to Antipolo, close to Metro Manila. So they will deliver the water from the location, from the dam in Quezon all the way to Rizal, which will now be close enough to Metro Manila to supply the concessionaires of MWSS, Manila Water and Maynilad. It's part of Sierra Madre. Just to be clear about it, it's part of the Sierra Madre mountain range, supposedly protected area, but the project has been given a go signal by government agencies, not just by the DNR, but also by the NCIP, among other agencies. Again, similar to the airport project, it will create jobs. The construction will create jobs. Probably not the operation itself, but the construction will create jobs. But again, we should be mindful of the displacement of communities, and in Quezon, especially of indigenous peoples. The Ata, Dumagat, the Remontados in Quezon. And last example for this, the land conversion. And I'm sure many of you, when you go home to your home provinces, you have seen the transformation in the last few years or decades of what used to be rice farms, rice fields. They are now highways, expressways, industrial parks, or subdivisions, residential subdivisions. And we don't have any national land use policy. There was a recent debate between two senators about which is more important, farming or subdivisions. There is a there are competing demands for land use, and unfortunately, agricultural lands are being sacrificed and are being converted for non-agricultural uses, industrial, commercial, and residential. Let us now look at the factors that make displacement possible. What factors are conducive to a decision to close down a company, for example? One is lack of employment security. And I'm sure many of you know that contracting is still rampant. The phenomenon of contracting out of labor is still rampant in the Philippines. So the regular employment status is more an exception than a general rule for many companies. It's very easy to dispense with non-regular employees. Second, the relatively low cost of dismissal. In some of the articles that I have reviewed, they're saying one policy recommendation is to make it expensive for companies to terminate workers. Here in the Philippines, and we will relate this later on to the regulation and the restrictions, it's very easy, it's very cheap to dismiss workers, especially workers who are not regular in their employment status. The third is the very low level of workers' unionization. When I was preparing the slides, I initially used the term weak unionization. But that could be misunderstood as referring to weak unions. We're not referring to weak unions. We're referring to a very low level of organizing unions. Anybody, would you like to have a guess on what is the percentage of workers who are unionized? And this is called the union density rate in the Philippines. What's the latest? Anybody? It's definitely less than 10. It's 7%. 7%. Only 7% of workers who are eligible for unionization are members of union. That amounts to a membership, total membership nationwide of all unions of only 1.5 million. This was pre-pandemic, 1.5 million. And CBA coverage, workers covered by collective bargaining agreements, is even less. the number of workers covered by CBAs is only 203,000. Imagine that. Only 203,000 are bargaining with their employers. In other countries, the agreement between unions and companies are seen as an effective way to either avert or manage the effects of mass dismissal. Here in the Philippines, it's not happening, simply because collective bargaining is more of an exception in many companies. And finally, lack of opportunities for re-employment. And primarily for one reason, that there is no demand. There is a very low demand for workers because there is a big number of unemployed. So if you are terminated at the age of 40 and above, in all probability you will not find any other job. That will be an early retirement for you. Unfortunately, it's not easy to get a job at that stage. How does this the displacement of a big number of employees impact the workers at the individual level? There are many effects. Of course, the economic. You lose your job, you lose your income. And there are many other side effects of losing one's job. Many of them are psychological. I encountered an ILO guide to displacements that devoted a whole section, a significant portion of the resources about managing the psychological effects of displacement, of losing your job. On the families, there are a number of impacts, of adverse effects. One, of course, the loss of income of the family. If you have the main earner of the family, the head of the family, or the major earner losing the job, that will affect the expenses of the family. That will affect the education of children. So children may stop their education because of the loss of the job of a parent or of both parents. It could result in problems with amortizations on their housing loan, which may eventually result in the family losing their home and being evicted because of that. So there are multiple effects of losing a person's job. And there's a very interesting discussion in that ILO guide saying that even relations among family members are affected. If, for example, and they're giving this as an example, if the husband, in one case, the husband lost his job, and then the wife was saying, I was not used to having my husband for the whole day in the house, which eventually resulted to conflicts between the spouses and also with the children. So we could also link this to domestic violence in some cases. And then on the communities, let's just go back to the Hanjin case. If you have a company, a shipyard, employing 30,000 workers, you have created a whole local economy in itself beyond the 30,000 workers employed in the shipyard. So there are many other workers supporting, catering to the needs of the Hanjin employees, of the Hanjin workers, addressing transportation needs, housing needs, food, and many others, goods and services. So if you close down that establishment, you are not only affecting the 30,000, you're affecting the whole community, and especially in some factories and establishments that are employing workers mostly from a particular area, from a particular geographic area. Even during the pandemic, the suspension of face-to-face classes affected many other allied businesses. School buses, they lost their businesses. Cafeterias, the school cafeterias, and even the vendors outside schools. The dormitories, they lost their business. Those who are manufacturing school bags, shoes, and other school supplies, those who are garments factories, who are manufacturing school uniforms, all those allied businesses stopped because of the policy that prevented face-to-face classes. So whenever we talk about displacement, even if you're talking about the formal economy, the formal sector, those who are directly employed by specific establishments, the closure of the establishment or a significant reduction in the personnel affects the community and many other businesses. The BPO industry is another example, and that's why the government was forcing the BPO sector to go back to their usual premise-based work, because the rents of the buildings, of the office space, went down significantly when the BPOs adopted the work from home arrangement. So there's a ripple effect when we talk about displacement. Now, let us look at how government responds to issues of displacement in terms of regulations, in terms of restrictions, for example. We have, of course, the prior notice requirement. If you are terminating employees, whether one employee or 100 or 1,000, thousands of employees, there is a requirement of prior notice, 30 days before the effectivity of the termination, to the employees affected and to the Department of Labor. Many decisions of the Supreme Court would explain the 30-day notice as an opportunity for workers to look for a job elsewhere. That is not realistic. I always clarify that to my class. You cannot expect to find a job in 30 days. If you are terminated, if the factory closes down, that 30-day period will not be enough for you. It's as if you can go to the next factory and apply, and you will get a job within 30 days. There's one case, fortunately, that explained a broader context for that policy, which is to prepare the worker psychologically for the loss of the job. That is more justifiable, the 30-day notice. Is that sufficient? No, definitely not. Separation pay, is that sufficient? Again, no. The maximum that you can get under Philippine law is 1 month pay for every year of service. Okay? So you need 12 years of service to get the equivalent of 1 year's salary. Imagine that. So for you to have a buffer income of 1 year, you need to have 12 years of service. And many workers will not have that. So even if you are given separation pay, and even if we consider the maximum period, that is not significant. And in addition to that, under Philippine law, as interpreted by jurisprudence, if the reason for the closure is serious business losses, then the company, the employer, is not mandated to pay any separation pay. So I don't know what happened to Hanjin, but the policy is that if the result, if the authorized cause that you are citing is closure due to serious business losses, no separation pay is due to the workers concerned. So again, that policy is not helpful as far as the dismissed workers are concerned. We have what is called as an unemployment insurance or temporary involuntary separation benefit. How much is that? Again, almost equivalent to 1 month's salary. It's not exactly what you are getting as your salary, because it is to be given to you by the SSS, by the Social Security system, and they base it on the average salary credit, which may be lower. It's close to your 1 month salary, but it's a one-time financial assistance. Only once. You will get it only once, equivalent to almost your 1 month salary. In fairness, the government has a re-employment program. But again, a re-employment program will only work if there are jobs available. Even if you retrain workers, even if you develop skills different from their current skills, if there are no jobs available, then no re-employment program of the government or any government agency for that matter will be successful, and the unemployment rate is still high. There's still millions waiting to be employed. So in summary, if we summarize the regulation responses, it is clear that we can readily see the inadequacy of the government regulatory policy and the government's active and passive responses to displacements. During the COVID pandemic, the Department of Labor had a program called CAMP, COVID Adjustment Measures Program. They gave a one-time financial assistance to employees affected by the closure, even temporary closure of companies. How much? 5,000 pesos, one time. How many days will it last for a family of 5 or 6? So if you had been out of work for 6 months, you get 5,000. That will not be enough. You can spend it in a week or even in less than a week. Now, finally, this is the last. This is the last slide. What can be done? What needs to be done? One is it should be an integrated package of interventions, starting with prevention of the displacement itself or mitigation of the effects. And there are documented cases. There are many case studies saying that there can be ways of avoiding mass dismissal. And there are studies showing that in many cases, dismissal of employees would be the company's first choice when it should be the last resort. So there should be ways of discussing and exploring alternative options for the company. But that will require discussion at the plant level with support from the government. That may include reduction of working hours, for example. In some cases, in some countries, that may also include reduction of wages, even the reduction of wages, just to avoid dismissal of employees, or rotation of employees, just to give everyone a chance to get even a certain amount of a percentage of their salary. Government subsidies should be there. Otherwise, the employer will not be able to do that. But the main point is you have to exert efforts to prevent the displacement, to prevent the closure of a company. So there can be other things explored: reorganization, restructuring, adjustments, short of dismissal of many employees. And it can also include voluntary dismissal, voluntary separation from employment. You can offer an early retirement program, and employees may choose to be included in that. So many plant level mechanisms can be tried to prevent, to avert mass displacement or mass dismissal. If dismissals had been done, then it's important to have a social safety net. And this is where unemployment insurance, financial assistance, even public employment or subsidies from the government will come in. So financial support primarily to address even the temporary needs of employees who are dismissed from work. And then finally, facilitation of re-employment. Again, either with a different company, in a different location, in a different area, or a different job altogether, requiring different skills, which will require what is called as an active labor market policy, which includes retraining, which includes active matching, job search, the government helping employees to search for jobs. And I will end by saying, in the Philippine context, the prospects are not good. Why? I'm usually optimistic, but but looking at what we need to do, this will require 3 key elements to succeed. Number 1, an active, responsive, proactive government. Number 2, a robust relationship between employer establishments, between companies, and workers represented by their unions, by their labor organizations. And number three, sufficient public funds for us to be able to deliver this package of interventions. And unfortunately, these three elements, currently we don't have. So sorry for ending on that not so optimistic note, but that's the reality of the situation. That's the big challenge facing all of us. Thank you. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Attorney Marlon. We just heard from Undersecretary Hans Kakdak that he's unfortunately still held up at the Department of Migrant Workers for an emergency. So unfortunately, we won't be having his presentation this morning. We apologize for that, but we'd like to move on to the open forum part of the session. We'd like to invite the speakers to come to the front if that's possible, at least occupy the seats in front. We'll invite members of the audience to ask their questions. You can use the microphone on the middle aisle and just, be concise when you're asking your questions. State your name and affiliation and let us know who the question is directed to. Anyone who would like to start the open forum and break the ice? Anyone? Maybe I can start and take advantage of my role as moderator for today. My question, I'm Patrick Perillo and I'm from the Ateneo Law School. I'm a professor here at the faculty. I'd like to ask a question for Marie-Luz with respect to the case that you've mentioned towards the end of your presentation. So I wonder if I think it's Mary Stokes versus Christian Brothers. I was wondering if this is a case that could already be brought to the European Court of Human Rights, because I understand that the case was dismissed on account of lack of evidence, or is this something that will still have to be brought again to a trial court or a lower court, if this is the case? Thank you very much.
Hello.
Or maybe you can just use the mic in the podium.
Hello, can you? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your question, Patrick. It relates actually to what I told as well yesterday. So because it's a case by the Supreme Court, if indeed the applicant Mary Stokes wants to to elevate the case to the Strasbourg court, it's possible. I haven't checked if there is any application now from her, but it's perfectly possible that she can really go to Strasbourg for discrimination. Now, technically, she cannot invoke only discrimination, which is one provision of the convention. She would have to invoke the right to family life or to private life or the right to education, which is in a protocol. But that's
Okay.
yeah, but that's possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is quite interesting because obviously we don't have a similar court in the region, and at the same time, the reason for the dismissal was the lack of evidence. So, I was just wondering whether that should still go back to trial or to investigation. But thank you very much for that. Oh, Felipe, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for Cecilia on IDPs. Well, you've referred to this long process of adopting a new bill on IDPs. But my question has to do with the legal status and with the usefulness of the UN Guiding Principles. Because in some countries, some courts are applying the UN Guiding Principles on IDPs. So could that be a solution in the meantime for the Philippines? And is there any campaign coming from civil society to push Congress to adopt this bill?
Thank you very much, Diego, for that question. Yes, the IDP bill has been going on like forever, and it actually codifies the rights in accordance with the guiding principles on internal displacement, but there have been some obstacles, and primarily because some of the security sector in the Philippines are actually against it because of its application in context of armed conflict. Now, the situation in the Philippines is that, of course, these rights that are enshrined in the guiding principles on internal displacement are the same rights that are in our Philippine Constitution and in many different laws. I mean, the difference, of course, in the guiding principles on internal displacement is that they explicate their direct applicability to IDPs. But the rights are there. So in terms, and always, being an IDP is never ever a legal status because everybody is a citizen or a resident of the country. So it's really, what is important is to mainstream the perspective and the specificity of being an IDP when it comes to the claim for those rights. Now, the courts have not really pronounced themselves specifically on rights of internally displaced persons as such, because then what would happen is that one would use other laws that are more generic when it comes to housing laws, for example. So during the Hayan, which is what we call Yolanda in the Philippines, and that also displaced thousands of disaster IDPs. What we did was, because we didn't have an IDP law, we used the RAs and the local and executive orders and local ordinances that protected right to housing of the IDPs. So that is the way that we would do it in the Philippines, because right now we don't have a specific law on IDP protection. I have to say, though, that one problem that we always encounter in the Philippines is one of the challenges I actually pointed out is the lack of accountability. And most of the time, the government treats internally displaced persons from a merely humanitarian point of view, looking at humanitarian assistance needs of internally displaced persons rather than engaging with IDPs from the perspective of a rights-based framework. So that is definitely something that needs to be done. Unfortunately, civil society is very small on IDP rights. And in fact, the push for the IDP law is seen to be an important leverage of these civil society organizations, but there are not enough of organizations doing the work.
Thank you very much. Other questions, interventions? Yes, please. Sorry, Judge will have you next. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sharon Milan from the University of San Agustin, Iloilo. So my question is for Professor Manuel. What would your numbers differ when we consider those who are workers who are now considering online work, freelance work? And from what I've observed, I have friends who do freelance work, online work, and they would ask me about their tax concerns. So we would discuss details of their work, and I have observed that they are paid low, or they are considered cheap labor by their clients from other countries. Would the numbers differ, and how would they affect the labor force that we have? Thank you.
The work from home arrangement is an offshoot of the COVID, the COVID pandemic, the COVID situation, and it's an interesting change in the employment landscape. In terms of how it may affect the figures, one, again, like the BPO example that I mentioned earlier, a work from home arrangement reduces the ability of enterprises to create peripheral jobs supporting the company. So that's one major effect. That's why I said that's the reason for the government's initial decision to compel the BPO companies to go back to face-to-face premise-based employment because of the significant number of not only reduction in rentals of office spaces, but also the losses of the businesses who used to cater to the needs of the BPO employees. I'm sure you have seen how the BPO industry has also changed the patterns. So you will see karaoke, videoke sessions as early as 6 o'clock in the morning because that's the dismissal time of the BPO. So there's a whole industry created out of the BPOs. That would be affected because of the work from home arrangement. On another aspect, the work from home arrangement may allow some employees to have a second job. And that may affect the unemployment, the underemployment figures that we have. And I think I'm not sure about the graduates, about the graduating college students, but there might be some preference for a more flexible working arrangement, and especially work from home, because of the traffic situation in most cities, because of the very high costs of housing. So if your home is very far from your place of work, then you will have rental costs. Then you can avoid that if you're allowed some flexibility, if you're allowed to work from home. So that may also affect preferences in terms of employment, and maybe in the long run that may be an encouragement for workers to stay in the Philippines instead of seeking employment elsewhere. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It just started recently. It would be good to see some studies related to that. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Please.
Good morning. I'm Judge Deliosa. I teach here at Ateneo Law. My question is for Marlon. One of the factors that you identified earlier that explain job displacement is the low number of trade unions in the country. Around 2004, there was a law passed, an act strengthening the right to self-organization. My first question is, do we have studies now evaluating the impact of the law on how it encouraged trade unionism, and whether, in fact, it contributed in encouraging workers to unionize? And then my second question is, what other policy interventions can be adopted to address the low number of unions in the country today?
Okay. This is how I will answer the questions. No? So improvements in the laws and in the rules had been done. But I think the main problem is that the government, and I hope there is a representative from the Department of Labor here, the Department of Labor is not taking it as a special mandate of the agency to encourage unionization. I've not seen any report of the Department of Labor aiming to increase the number of unions or the number of employees covered by collective bargaining agreements. I don't see that as a target for the Department of Labor and Employment. That should be part of their performance-based bonus. For those who are in government, you understand how it affects. I don't see it as a priority for the government, not for the Department of Labor. I have always heard the Department of Labor's proclaiming that we have few strikes last year. Of course, because there are very few unions who can hold strikes. But unless the Department of Labor sees that as a major program, encouraging unionization, supporting employees' initiatives to organize unions, then we will not have it. We will not have it. That's a policy framework. That's a perspective change that we need to see from the government. I can understand why companies in general are averse to having their employees unionized. But government should not have the same attitude insofar as unions are concerned. And government should encourage both workers and companies to support unionization of workers, not only through laws, not only through regulations, but in terms of practices, in terms of policies and programs of the government. So no amount of improvement in the law will address that situation unless we have that policy shift. And that includes the Supreme Court also in terms of ruling on cases involving unionization.
Thank you. Other questions? Please.
Hello, Patrick. How are you, Patrick? So, my name is Adli Hasmi. I'm from Indonesia. I'm student of APMA program from Mahidol University and now in Ateneo University. My question is for Ma'am Cecilia. It is quite interesting that discussing the IDP. Well, Indonesia right now trying to move the capital. It's also mentioned as one of the factors of IDP is the business development, right? So this is the problem with the Indonesia. As we trying to move to the Borneo, our capital, it was forests actually, and there are people that undocumented because we have 14,000 island, obviously. There are indigenous people that lives there. A problem is when the projects happening, they just discover that they're people, and then they don't have rights, they don't have housing as well because they live in the woods. So what do you, in your point of view, how to settle this? Because the government usually have the abuse of power. They just get rid of everything, move everything. That's what happened in Indonesia. And also, it also happened for indigenous people in Java, while cement or oil company usually just build the project and get rid of the indigenous people. It's really hard for us as well. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Indonesia always came up in my engagements with UN member states with regard to situations of IDPs, not only with regard to Java, but also Papua, and of course that case that I mentioned on Aceh. In any case, the projected transfer of your capital from Jakarta to this area will definitely affect the people in that area, and particularly since they are indigenous peoples, they must be given affirmative attention. The guiding principles is very clear that people with a special attachment to the land must have, the displacement must be minimized to the extent possible. Of course, it doesn't mean that displacement may not happen, but should displacement happen, there has to be a lot of mitigating measures that the government must undertake, and particularly not so much merely in resettling, but ensuring that the people, the indigenous peoples in that area, must somehow be also integrated into the project, and why not? And that is really the respect for the indigenous people's rights. So here we see a confluence between two legal frameworks, the guiding principles on internal displacement, which also provides two things: prevention of arbitrary displacement, and secondly, mitigation of the displacement consequences should it be necessary. But you have to justify the necessity of that displacement. And that's one legal framework. And on the other hand, we also have the legal framework of, again, very soft law, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So There is no win-win situation for everybody in this particular case, and we know that the state has the right of eminent domain, but there has to be a very inclusive and comprehensive process that will really mitigate the effects of displacement, and as well as ensure the guarantee of rights, particularly on the specific people who will be involved. I would like at this point to say that displacement per se is not prohibited. What is prohibited under international law are two things: arbitrary displacement, and secondly, the disregard of the human rights of the internally displaced persons if it will be necessary that they are displaced. I have a report, but into the GA on prevention of arbitrary displacement, but this is in the context of armed conflict and violence, but maybe you may want to consult the last report I gave, which is on development-induced displacement, which is precisely what you are talking about. I mean, we can talk more, but just in a synthesis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other interventions, comments, questions? Yes, please.
Tanong ko kay Marlon. Marlon, what do you think about this emerging trend of virtual assistants, where the hiring is mostly from the Philippines? And of course, as you rightly pointed out, the virtual online jobs is a product of COVID. And now, you know, virtual assistants basically mostly for US companies, where they hire people in the Philippines, and they're usually given a good, you know, a salary. $1,200 is the average, but of course it doesn't have any social security. It's hard to unionize in the first place, etc. But what do you think about this development and how that will affect workers' rights? It's a new trend that is really coming up more and more, particularly in countries like ours.
Even before the pandemic, and even before the rise of the BPO sector in the Philippines, we already had the medical transcription services. So that's a form of the virtual assistant. So we had Filipino workers based in the Philippines, but employed by companies outside the Philippines, but doing work from home in the Philippines. So these are pre-pandemic work from home virtual employment arrangements. If that will increase, although in terms of the number, we are not, the industrial sector is still the major employer in terms of the absolute number of workers employed. But even assuming we have an increase in virtual assistants, and that because of the pandemic, many companies outside the Philippines will now be open and ready to hire employees based in the Philippines, even outside the BPO industry, or new jobs not traditionally covered by the BPO industry. I think it will affect the overseas employment in particular. If you can work with a significant salary in the Philippines, in your home, but for a foreign company, I think that will be reason enough not to apply for work abroad. So eventually, we may see that trend. Of course, again, that job may require some skills that may not be applicable to many Filipinos who are working abroad. So the change may not be significant. So it would be interesting to see that. But I think the direct impact will be on the number of employees going going abroad, because we have seen doctors leaving the Philippines to work abroad as nurses. So if there are opportunities to work in the Philippines virtually for companies based outside the Philippines, I think that's a good opportunity for Filipino workers, and a deterrence for further flight of Filipino skilled workers from the Philippines.
Thank you. Other questions or feedback? I think we've heard from these three rows. Maybe the last row, you might have some questions too. Okay, I think we're... Anyone? Yes? Did we have anyone raising their hands? Oh, please, go ahead, Miss Marie-Luz.
I've actually a question which applies to both Ron and Manuel. In terms of these, or even Cecilia, in terms of this development aggression, I'm wondering if in terms of, the loss of agricultural lands, if, it affects the population there and it affects the environment. So I'm wondering if the activists, the environmental activists are very active in the Philippines, and if they actually congregate with people or workers or other indigenous people to stop these projects, if there is a movement like that. So because I know that in other countries it's the case.
Okay. They're quite active. In fact, the one in Sibuyan Island was featured prominently in the news because they really erected the barricade and prevented the further destruction of the island. So it's now currently there's no operation going on right now. However, the downside is there are already 6 SLAP suits. These are strategic lawsuits against public participation that have been filed against the local communities. So they still face that kind of legal harassment, and the ability of local communities to stand up to protect their rights against development aggression is still a problem. And over the last few years and decades, the support that's been given by many organizations to these communities have gone down. The Philippines is no longer the favorite of developmental agencies. It's transferred to other countries as well.
Anyone else who would like to comment?
Maybe just to add, the Philippines unfortunately is second in the world with regard to the deaths of environmental defenders. And this is really very concerning, obviously, next to Brazil. And the Philippines is actually the second. And then the second point the next point I'd like to make is as well that there is maybe also in reference to what you were talking about in terms of civil society. Unfortunately, there is some kind of a siloed approach towards fighting for the environment and fighting for the rights to prevent internal displacement. And it seems that they're not really talking. So an environmentalist will talk more about the need to conserve and protect the environment. And an internally displaced person will talk about the right to stay in the place rather than having a confluence of their, practically the same cause in terms of struggle and rights movement. And part of one of the consequences of that is that sometimes environmental defenders and also people who are fighting for to prevent internal displacement are not considered human rights defenders. We talked about this. We talked about human rights defenders yesterday, but the broad interpretation of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, 1998 as well, really makes it very obvious, at least to me, that these environmental rights defenders and those who are trying to fight for their rights to stay and not to be displaced are human rights defenders. So there is a need for a perspective change and upscaling as well, the coordination and the work between, and basically breaking the silos of struggles.
Yeah,
Thank
just a quick addition, and this is on the side of organizing, and this is related to what Sedge mentioned. While there are still silos in terms of advocacies, we have seen, well, historically the Philippines is strong in terms of community organizing. It started in the 70s or even prior to that. But community organizing historically had been sector-based. So farmers federations, workers unions, fisher folk working on issues of fisher folks, urban poor associations working on housing issues. But more recently, and especially in reference to big ticket projects, we have seen more multi-sectoral organizing and also collaboration in campaigns, especially for national issues. So that's a good development of community organizing. There's still silos, but we're seeing more collaboration among different groups, among different sectors, especially among the big coalitions.
Thank you very much. Just final call for any other feedback or questions. If there's none, just before we close the morning session, just a few reminders. So we'll have lunch after this session, still at the cafeteria on the ground floor. And also, we still have an afternoon session as well. So that will be, presentations from our Asia Pacific Master of Arts students in Human Rights and Democratization. So we have some of them here. So they'll be talking about regional human rights issues on migrant workers, refugees, right to education, right to suffrage in different parts of Asia Pacific. So I hope that you can still join us this afternoon. It will be at 2:30 at the Berna Seminar Room, just above this floor. And, so hopefully, yeah, just above. I mean, it's like the annex, right? So it's a little above anyway. So we still take a flight of stairs going up, but the ushers will be assisting you. So if you're not familiar with the area, someone will be there to assist you. But we thank you, our guests, for joining us this morning. Okay, so go ahead. Dean Maita will be giving some remarks as well. Thank you.
Just two things. I do realize that in our main invitation to everyone, it was only the morning sessions that were identified. So the afternoon session is actually voluntary. You'll still get your certificates of participation having attended this morning's sessions, okay? But having said that, the APMA students are hopefully very keen to present their work. So if there are those of you, aside from our visiting professors, who can stay and listen and comment perhaps on their various works, then that would be great, and you can join us after lunch. The other thing that I wanted to just say is, again, just a reminder on the evaluation form. It's not due until after all the sessions, but I think it's important enough that I keep repeating it. All right, so thank you very much for your participation this morning, and see you guys at lunch.